The former head of the UK Ministry of Defense wrote an article in the Telegraph saying that Ukraine is winning. Now let's finish the job. How to finish the job? He's suggesting that the West has to send more funds and weapons to Ukraine, and Kiev must mobilize as many young people as possible. He says that the average age of the AFU soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers at the front, is over 40. How did you find it?
First, that's an absolutely ludicrous proposition that Ukraine is winning. Anyone stating that, especially someone in his posture, has got to be a liar and lying for various and sundry purposes, many of which I could guess at, or he's got to be a fool, a complete fool. And what he's suggesting in terms of Ukraine reminds me of a conversation I had today with regard to the United States starting a war with China. 300,000 Americans would be across the Canadian border, another 200,000 across the Mexican border in the first 10 days. I'm sorry, what are you going to do? Take babies from Ukraine? Because we're not looking at a country that in the beginning had a substantial population, especially compared to the 140 some odd million Russians. And it's been bled majorly over the last year or year and a half, almost 2 years. And it's just preposterous. It again shows how we have some people in the security complex in the West who are either smoking some really bad stuff, or they have other reasons to be advancing the positions they're advancing. And I suspect the latter is the reason most of the time.
If you remember, if you recall, last year, General Mike Milley suggested that the only solution for this was going to be a negotiating table. Right after that, he was silenced. Who's silencing him on that issue?
Well, he's retired now. His retirement ceremony was a few days ago. A gala affair by any comparison, even reminded me a bit of Colin Powell's back in the day. And I don't think he wanted to go out the door making any statement at all, particularly one against his commander-in-chief, which it would have been had he told the truth. And he didn't want to tell a lie either. So he just remained silent, and I can appreciate that. We've got a situation now in this country. Reading the papers this morning and checking with some of my both Democrat and Republican, the few I have left contacts, we've got a real situation in the House of Representatives right now in this country. There is a really good chance that all Ukraine assistance is going to stop, at least for an interim period, if not permanently. And it's going to happen because of the situation, the political situation, unprecedented political situation in the U.S. House of Representatives, where we've just lost a speaker by the vote of his own party. And we have candidates for that job who have essentially said, not a penny more to Ukraine. So there's going to be an abrupt stop to the support for Ukraine if that is the case. And to have people speaking as you just quoted is simply ridiculous. They're not looking at reality.
In your opinion, why they're suggesting that? They know that Ukraine is not able to win this war. The only outcome of this game is going to be just killing more and more Ukrainians.
Absolutely. It's even more absurd than you just suggested, though you did a pretty good job of expressing the absurdity. They are beating themselves to death on these echelons of defense that the Russians have set up. And let's look, what does that portend for the future? If Russia becomes so successful in bleeding Ukraine, and there's every prospect that they might be, then we invite Russia to mount a counter-offensive, one that might take substantial portions of Ukraine that Russia never has coveted. Russia did not want initially, but now you've got the blooding, you've got war, you've got what Clausewitz called it never is what you thought it was going to be once it gets going. And that's what we've got. And we're just begging the situation to turn against Ukraine so desperately and so dismally that Russia becomes an outright victor. That's not a good solution either for this conflict. We needed weeks ago to be at the table getting a diplomatic solution.
It's so amazing the situation of Europe right now.
I think it's a byproduct of what's happening in Ukraine and the dissatisfaction with it, but it's also a byproduct, and even more so, of what NATO has become and what American hegemony has deteriorated to. Sooner or later, the Europeans are going to wake up and understand that they have an entity, and it is $22-23 trillion in its GDP annually. It's as powerful as the United States were it to get its political act together, and it certainly doesn't have its political act together. But that's a formidable force in the world, and it's being kept from realizing any kind of real potential because of us, and now because of its allegiance to NATO in a losing conflict, one that every day is going to become more and more apparent to them that it's lost. And here's what I suspected the Poles were being used by us to do, and by the British. They were going to be the country that began to darken Zelensky's name. They were going to be the country that began to take opposition to Zelensky. And that would color him and begin to get him in a position where we could dispose of him. I still think that may be part of our purpose. But the major problem with Poland, of course, as you know, is the farm business. You know, the Ukraine turning its farm products internal to the EU because it can't sell them overseas, or it's being blocked from selling them overseas by the Russians. And that's really threatening Polish farmers. And ultimately, it'll threaten other EU farmers who are very, very well taken care of, by the way, by the EU. And they don't like this. So they've got to respond to their domestic publics too. And they're going to do that more and more. Germany too, eventually. France too, eventually. So I see us using some of this angst, and Poland would be the perfect candidate for it, to begin to back away from Ukraine, and then to say ourselves, Biden in particular, oh, we can't keep this up if we can't keep our allies with us. So we're going to have to reconsider our position too. It'll be slow and it'll be carefully done, I suspect, but that'll be what they do. They need to get to diplomacy now, though. They don't need to walk down this route of alienating everybody in Kyiv, including Zelensky, maybe getting him killed, getting him removed from office. They don't need to do that. Let's go and let's talk. And let's get this conflict settled. And let's get it settled before, as I said, the Russians make so many battlefield gains, maybe even a counteroffensive that's successful, and then it's a whole new ballgame in terms of what the denouement is, what the results are.
Who's in charge for the decision of going to negotiating table?
Opinion is changing in the United States daily. Today, it was turning more negative in a shorter 48-hour period, it said, than I've seen it previously. It's just going to go more and more negative. And when I say negative, against more money to Ukraine, against Zelensky, against the whole war in the heart of Europe, and against the United States being so readily identified with it and so monetarily committed to it. It's changing. I'd say right now in the United States, Democrat and Republican and Independent are 51 to 52% against this conflict. That's going to build. It's going to grow. Biden will pay attention to that. And as it grows to the point where he thinks it's going to impact his election chances, he will change his policy. I just hope that's not too late. I hope we're not past the point, as I just described, where Russia gets a new incentive and takes on a whole new posture in this conflict and says, to hell with the U.S. elections, to hell with all that. I don't care. I'm going to take as much territory as I can, and then I'll present it to you as a fait accompli. I mean, that's where we're headed now. That's the dynamic of war. All these people need to read Clausewitz. That's the way war happens. You never get what you think you're going to get, and suddenly the other side against whom you've got your forces arrayed gets something that you didn't want it to get, and that changes the whole complexion of the war. The whole war takes on a new meaning and a new force and a new reality. And with Russia doing that, we could have some of the fears that people have falsely, in my view, posited about Moscow, that they might even go further. That's not something we want to develop. We do not want to develop a successful Russian juggernaut in the heart of Europe.
The war in Ukraine, it's so different from that one in Iraq, in Afghanistan. United States was in a region.
With one exception, U.S. incompetence is on visible display on a daily basis. Sorry.
Yeah, because the US went to Iraq, Afghanistan. These are culturally totally different. The US troop gonna be totally a stranger in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the Russian soldier in eastern Ukraine is gonna be its home.
Well, we felt the same way. Some of the rhetoric here, and indeed some of the major media were carrying stories like this because we have a substantial Ukrainian population in the United States. The rhetoric here was, these are white people. These are Christians. These are people who actually have a head of the church and everything, and they believe in a single God and all that, although the Christianity is three gods, it isn't one. If you think about it, it's the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. If that's not three, I don't know what the hell is. But we thought that Ukraine was like us. We thought that that would be the right war at the right time in the right place. And oh, by the way, we could make tons of money off of it, which we have. Now it's turning sour. Now the Russians are going to win.
Lindsey Graham says that if we stop sending weapons and funds to Ukraine, it's going to send a bad signal to China.
China's not. Xi Jinping and the Central Party School and the people in China who develop Chinese strategy and execute Chinese strategy are not looking at Ukraine for that purpose. They're not looking at it to see if the United States has staying power. What they're looking at it for is to see how the United States, without risking a single solitary person of its own, is bleeding a country in the heart of Europe. That's what they're looking at. Probably most of the strategists are shaking their heads and saying, I wish I could find a conflict like that. It's pretty good for the United States, making tons of money and also reestablishing some of its hegemony over countries that it was losing its hegemony over, mainly Germany. That, of course, I think is going to reverse itself. As I've said before, it's going to reverse itself majorly, and probably not too long in the future now. But China's looking at the strategy that they've been looking at all along. They were just in Sri Lanka. They want to anchor their Belt Road initiative in South Asia with Sri Lanka on one end and ultimately Taiwan on the other, and they're in no hurry to get Taiwan. That gives them what some have called the Blue Dragon strategy. And it's really a pretty decent strategy if you take a look at it. They don't call the Indian Ocean the Indian Ocean. Hell no, they don't. They call it the Western Ocean. And they don't call it the Indian Ocean because India is one of their primary potential enemies. And they don't like the name Indian Ocean. They are developing an ability to dominate that Western Ocean. And we're just watching it happen. Sri Lanka is playing us like a fiddle with the people we just sent over there to get the military agreement solidified and give them a pittance compared to what China's given them. China's just moving on, not paying a whole lot of attention, I don't think, to what we're doing in Ukraine, except, kind of marveling at the fact that we're doing it without any blood being shed on our behalf. Chinese strategists would think that was very Sun Tzu-ian. They would think that was pretty neat. Except what's happening, they realize, is that the United States is headed towards destroying NATO. And I've said that before. NATO is very short-lived right now. And it is so principally because it always was so once the Cold War was over. But now we've put the coup d'etat to it by this Ukraine conflict and our alienation eventually of our NATO allies. They are tiring of this too. Read the papers. Look at what just happened in Slovakia. That might not be the greatest indicator, but look at what's happening in other capital cities. Look at what's happening in Germany, and you'll see that people are going to grow very disenchanted with this conflict because they're not stupid. They can see what's happening on the battlefield there. I used to go to the Finns and the Swedes and some other Scandinavians who would observe the Russians in their major exercises each year for their opinion of what was happening with the Russians. They're very astute observers of military exercises like those the Russians conducted, corps and division size exercises. Well, they're watching the very same thing in reality happen in Ukraine. And they're watching Russia's defense grind the Ukrainians up. This can't continue. These people aren't stupid. And they're going to vote with their feet with regard to NATO if we don't do something about it pretty shortly and in this conflict. They're going to do that anyway, but we could elongate the time that NATO continues to exist as a feasible alliance, if you will, if we ended this conflict and did it diplomatically, because that would probably take a few years. That's my guess. It's going to take some time to do it. It may take a demilitarized zone. It may take a situation like Cyprus or maybe even the Korean Peninsula or whatever. It may take some UN troops and so forth in order to get it settled and to keep it settled. And that may give NATO another lease on life because it might be a participant in some of that. But otherwise, I think NATO's done, fini.
Why the politicians are so obsessed with China?
They can't find anything else. I asked the same question of Secretary Powell in 2002 when Richard Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, probably the most powerful man in the government at that point, essentially crafted a strategy to make China the new Cold War enemy of the United States, the Soviet Union having disappeared. They courted Chen Shui-bian in Taipei. They tried to get him to go for a referendum for independence, which Beijing said, red line, red line, red line. Multiple times they said it. Cheney would dispatch his man, Rumsfeld would dispatch his man to Taipei, and they would tell Chen Shui-bian, go ahead, have your independence referendum. We would send our person, or we would get our AIT section in Taipei, Doug Paul at the time, Ambassador Paul, to go in and talk to the National Security Advisor or even Chen Shui-bian himself and tell them, no, you don't. Don't you do this. We do this every week virtually because they wanted a new Cold War. Those people haven't gone away. They have not gone away. Some of them have new names like Victoria Nuland, but they haven't, like Kurt Campbell, but they haven't gone away. And they are still very influential in U.S. policymaking, security policy in particular. And they want China for a new Cold War. Very productive, very, very lucrative. They have investments in Lockheed Martin, investments in Raytheon. Very lucrative. You shift from Ukraine, where you're making a fortune, over to China, and you make another fortune. This is what it's all about today, making money off war. Now, do they want a hot war with China? That's a question. That's a huge question, because I don't think they're that stupid. But how do you parse that line? How do you walk that line? How do you parse that problem? How do you keep China from thinking and maybe preempting? How do you keep China from using force, for example, against Taiwan just to see how serious we are? Because I think they know we're not going to use force to defend Taiwan. We will remonstrate. We will send demarches. We will sail ships. We will do all manner of things, but we're not going to risk a single American sailor, soldier, airman, marine, or space guardian to defend Taiwan. Now, China could test that at any moment. I don't think they will, because they're pretty happy where they are right now. As I said, their strategy is unfolding from Bandar Abbas to Beijing, from Colombo to the end of the Chinese Belt Road Initiative, wherever it might be. It's looking a heck of a lot like it might even be in the South China Sea or the Western Sea, maybe even further. If we do what we're doing right now with Korea and Japan to the intense stupidity that we just did it with Korea, holding the president's arm behind his back and telling him he has to ship 500,000 rounds of ammunition to Ukraine, we may play right into China's ball game with regard to those two countries in the Northeast Asia. Longtime allies that we may cause to think more about neutrality than about continuing the alliance. This is a changing world. It's a very rapidly, swiftly changing world, and we need to start doing something other than playing guitars like Tony Blinken did recently. I'm glad to see he can play a guitar. I wish he could do diplomacy. I wish we could do diplomacy. I wish we could look at this world that is changing so fast, it's blinding, and accommodate it. Because if we don't, we're going to be behind the train watching it go down the track.
There is an article in Politico says fighting against the USSR, Soviet Union, didn't necessarily make you a Nazi. How is that possible? You know, they're so confusing. Did you see what happened in Canada? They were literally cheering a Nazi, and now they're blaming everything on Russia. How long they gonna play this game?
Well, this is nothing new, really. Americans are ignorant of their history to an extent that sometimes makes me ill. We took advantage of the Nazis that we pulled out of the Nuremberg trials after World War II, including Werner von Braun, who wound up being the daddy of our rocket program. But there were lots of others too that people in the CIA and elsewhere, Dulles had a lot to do with some of it, pull these people out, and we took care of them, and they worked for us, and they did what we needed them to do in order to make our defenses and our offenses vis-a-vis the Soviet Union more powerful and stronger. We have no problem working with Nazis when it's in our interest to do so. Indeed, look at our history. We have no problem working with all manner of dictators all across the face of the earth. The CIA report on Saddam Hussein, quote, "This is a young man with whom we can work." That's what the report said early on when he first took power in Iraq. We don't have any problem working with tyrants. We simply don't. We've always been able to work with tyrants. It backfires on us sometimes, as it did with Saddam Hussein. But that's the price of our kind of foreign policy in the world, and security policy in particular. People forget. I don't forget because I was there. I was on the peninsula twice in Korea, that Park Chung-hee was a dictator. And that when the Koreans began to mobilize in the streets for democracy, we in the military, the US military, took offense. And we actually deployed forces trying to keep that from happening. But the Korean people wouldn't hear about it. And thank God we had a president who said, stop. And, Korea became a democracy. But we didn't like it becoming a democracy because we knew it would be more difficult to deal with as a democracy than it would be as a one-man dictatorship, Park Chung-hee.
Do you see any will in the Biden administration to find a solution for the situation in Ukraine before 2024, or they're going to hand it over to the next administration?
I think their aspiration is that they will not do anything different from what they are doing now until they are assured of the White House. And that is a very, very difficult proposition to complete in the positive sense until you're elected, because there's so many variables in it, not least of which is what happens to Donald Trump, now still the greatest poll grabber in the Republican Party, and what happens in the House, and how much further that really degrades the Republican Party in terms of any kind of unity at all. We may have a single party country here coming up very shortly if the Democrats are smart and play it right. The problem with that is it'll give Biden even more reason to pause on Ukraine and not do anything, just kind of try to keep the status quo going, this stalemate where they bleed the hell out of the Ukrainians. I'm afraid they're going to run out of Ukrainians to bleed before the election. But there's no incentive for him other than he suddenly sees Russia on a counteroffensive and grinding up territory toward the West. There's no incentive for him to do it. He just sits on his laurels and goes ahead. The economy's doing pretty well. Jobs are up. Everything's looking, the Republicans are destroying themselves. Everything's looking pretty good for him. So for him to be a chance taker, a risk taker now, is just not usually in the cards for the domestic political situation in this country.
I think Biden going to be remembered for centuries for this foreign policy.
I think those who have been in positions of leadership for the last 20 plus years, from really the terrorist incident on September 11th, 2001 to the present time, are going to be remembered by historians as having, if not lost the American empire, done severe and probably irreparable damage to it. Physically, morally, ethically, and power-wise. That's what the reality of this situation is. So bad, so lousy leadership that I would compare it to when Cicero went before the Roman Senate and essentially accused Colin of his conspiracy. Imo vero etiam est, here he is in the Senate. He walks in the Senate every day. That's where we are in terms of empire and our personal situation in the world, our national situation in the world. And no one seems to recognize it. No one seems to recognize it except a few pundits like, myself and a few others that are now saying things like this on a fairly regular basis. Some of them with more circumspection than I, because they're not 80 years old. They want to maintain the possibility of their returning to government and doing something about it. And they know if they become too much like me, they're never going to have a chance to return to government. Political situation in this country just wouldn't allow it. But they believe as stridently as I do in terms of where we are and how bad it is, and where Europe is and how bad it is for them. And by the way, I don't think the Chinese and the Russians are allies. They are, if anything, friends of convenience. They will never be true allies, in my view, because there's just too much history between them and too much of a, let me be frank, power differential between them. Russia is still, in many respects, a capital city with a gas station. And until it is more diversified, until it's got a more robust future for its economic outlook and so forth, I don't think the Chinese are all that interested in it except for that gas and what it might do for them. They're also interested in things like just happened, I think, between North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and Russia, where Russia essentially told Kim Jong-un, you want to hit the United States with a nuclear missile, you want to hit it with a warhead that will detonate within a 10-meter CEP, you want an accurate ICBM with warheads, maybe multiple warheads on it, a MIRV warhead, we will help you. I think that's what's happening now as a result of Biden's very poor attempt to coerce, well, he was successful, reluctantly, I think, on the part of the president, but he coerced the South Korean president into doing what he did with respect to Ukraine. Kim Jong-un took advantage of that. Russia took advantage of that. And now we knew in the early 2000s that the way North Korea moved so rapidly to actually having a nuclear weapon and exploding one, we knew it was because of the Russian technicians that escaped the Cold War Soviet Union, went throughout the world to Iran, to Libya, to North Korea, and so forth, and began to work for them in their nuclear weapons programs. They succeeded in North Korea. Now they're just taking them another step. And they're doing it in response to that idiot diplomacy that Biden pulled off in South Korea and that Blinken and everybody else touted as a great diplomatic feat. Well, I'll tell you what you did. You put North Korea in a position to hit the United States, anywhere in the United States, with a very accurate nuclear warhead or two in the very near future. How do you like that, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary of State?
One of the important factors in this war in Ukraine was the corruption in Ukraine. John Kirby said that no corruption in Ukraine, but I mean, I don't know. How did you find it?
When I was chief of staff from 2002 to 2005, Powell sort of gave me Ukraine as my portfolio. North Korea I had all the time. Ukraine kind of came to me by accident. And I began to manage such personalities as Yevtushenko and Timoshenko. And I began to realize that they were all crooks. They were all corrupt. They used their personal fortunes to make more personal fortune and to buy political power. And it didn't matter whether they were Ukrainian nationalists or they were Russians or both. Sometimes they were both, depending on which side the power lay that day. Very corrupt country, probably one of the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth, truth be told. And we've declared them a Jeffersonian democracy, or just short thereof, and Zelensky, the new Jefferson. This is preposterous, and the military knows that. The U.S. military knows that. They've been there. They've been in Georgia. They've been in Poland. They've been in Ukraine. Ever since the Cold War ended, we've been there. helping their ministries of defense and so forth. They know how corrupt this country is. So to hear this, the military, the majors and the lieutenant colonels and the colonels must be laughing their butts off, but at the same time, wringing their hands because their political leaders are saying untruths and doing things based on those untruths.
Is that possible for Ukraine joining the EU in the current situation?
Zero possibility, I think, for at least 10 to 15 years. And I wouldn't even say it would happen then. That's the most important organization for them to join, because it would mean they'd have to clean up their act, the act you and I described earlier, the corruption and everything. It would mean they'd have to bring some form of justice to their system. It would mean that they'd have to have decent leadership, at least the equivalent of other European Union countries. It'd mean all manner of things, clean and healthy for Ukraine. And the process of building towards that would be very cleansing and very healthy for Ukraine, I think. It isn't going to happen. It just isn't going to happen, nor is NATO membership. So what is Ukraine's future? Several years ago, when I was asked the question, what should Ukraine's position be now? This was before the invasion. I said neutrality. I called it a studied neutrality. And the person who was interrogating me said, what do you mean by studied? I said, very carefully arrived at, in consultation with all the surrounding powers, including the big ones and the little ones, and an agreement that EU membership might be in the future, 15, 20 years down the road, after they had really proven they could be a good neutral. And neutrality is a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do unless you're geographically positioned perfectly, like Finland, for example. It's really hard to do. But Ukraine could have effected it, I think, given that it would have been accepted by the two major powers, Washington and Russia, if it were done smartly. And if the Russians who were living in Ukraine were taken care of. And I mean taken care of, their language could continue to go on. They could educate their children in their language and such as that. And then things would have been, 10, 15 years down the road, I think, tolerable. And they would have been a member of the EU, and maybe even that would have sucked, as we wanted to at the end of the Cold War, Russia into a better relationship with the EU, maybe even possible membership at some point. After all, they're a European country. It's gone. It's gone, and it's gone largely because of the mistakes of the United States of America, followed loyally by Albion, Britain, and others in NATO.
We know that Putin and Xi didn't participate in G20. How do you see these changes that are happening in that part of the world?
I think people are making moves. States and their leaders are making moves, and usually when it's a dictatorship, you can see the move a little more clearly because there's not the obfuscation of the politics, based on their interpretation of the future, and they think there might be alternative futures. One of the best countries to look at right now in that regard, because as much as I might detest Mohammed bin Salman as a person, and all I have to do is go back to Kamal Khashoggi to detest him majorly. He is astute in terms of his plan for Saudi Arabia. And when we say, look at what we've done in the region with the Abraham Accords and so forth, he's looking at it not through those lenses. He's looking at it as, I got the U.S. taken care of. Now let me take care of Russia. Now let me take care of China. He's playing all the cards, and he will go when he thinks it's the right timing. He will go with that consortium of power that is in Saudi Arabia's interest. That's what others are doing too, including these things like G7, G8, G20, the BRICS, and so forth. They're getting together and manipulating their own agendas, but they're ASEAN even. They're doing it in accordance with their aspirations for the future, for their own country and their own organization, but based on several alternative scenarios. No one's betting on a single scenario. They used to bet on the United States almost exclusively, at least those countries we felt were lined up with us most of the time during the Cold War. No longer. They all have alternative scenarios that they can pursue at the drop of a pen, and they will do so. And when they all or many of them at one time decide to abandon us, watch the shock on Washington's face. Your country's a perfect example. You know, a medium country with a big territory, a lot of people, a lot of latent power, a real influence on the business of climate change and getting a handle on it, and now got a leader who's not afraid to tell Washington it's naked, and is going to do what he needs to do for Brazil. This is going to take place in more countries, one after the other, as time goes by.
What happened to that Bernie Sanders who was against wars?
He's a total disappointment. Several years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I went to the Congress with two other gentlemen, both of whom were experts on the defense budget. And we sat down with the Senate Budget Committee, professional staffers, not personal staffers, very competent people, 20 years plus in the Senate. And they looked at us and they said, tell us how to cut this incredible defense budget. And we said, get your papers out, get your pencils out. And we started telling them how to do it. We told them how to take $1 trillion out of it over 10 years, $100 billion a year, not hurt national security at all, and save $1 trillion over 10 years. In the middle of this, Bernie Sanders came in. He had a big legal pad and he sat down and he started taking notes and he asked great questions. And each time we'd give him an answer, he'd write it down. We left there with him assuring us that not everything, but the things that he could get done that we had given him on that list, he was very grateful for, and he was going to take out. He has not done one damn thing that he said he was going to do that day. So I've given up on Bernie Sanders.